The sun over Karachi hadn't yet burned away the early haze when Pan Am Flight 73, Clipper Empress of the Seas, a Boeing 747-121, rolled to a stop on the tarmac for its scheduled stopover. It was September 5th, 1986. The cabin smelled faintly of brewed coffee and reheated croissants. People were stiff from the overnight leg out of Bombay and focused on connections onward to Frankfurt and, for many, New York. 13 Indian cabin crew moved like a single organism, checking doors, head counts, and galley stock. Among them, the senior purser, 23-year-old Neerja wore that particular calm you see in the best professionals. Eyes that take in everything, a voice tuned for reassurance. A fresh bus of Karachi passengers was just arriving. There were 379 souls on board, including crew, a blur of languages and passports. Americans, Indians, Pakistanis, Italians, Britons, Germans. Families pinned travel tags to toddlers. Business travelers guarded briefcases with exaggerated care. In first class, a young mountaineer thumbed his passport. In economy, 3 siblings argued quietly about seat swaps. It had the choreography of any big city morning, until the rhythm broke. A vehicle in airport security livery jolted across the ramp with sirens and lights. 4 men in olive uniforms sprinted up the mobile stairs. The first burst of gunfire cracked the air and turned hundreds of heads at once. Training took over. Neerja's hand went to the interphone and her body slid out of the hijacker's line of sight. With a quiet code, barely more than breath, she alerted the cockpit. Seconds later, the flight deck crew dropped through the 747's overhead escape hatch, riding steel reels to the tarmac. Without pilots, the jet could not be flown. Immobilized. A building, not a weapon. That small technical detail would create a slim margin of safety for everyone left inside. In the forward galley, Neerja steadied a junior attendant's hands on the coffee pots, even as gunmen shoved through curtains, screaming for the cockpit to return. Her eyes scanned the aisles, exits L1 and R1 now blocked by armed men, middle doors within reach if she needed them, slides armed, passengers frozen. She took a breath, gathered the crew's eyes one by one, and offered the most precious thing in a sealed cabin: direction. "We stay low, we listen, we move when we must." She spoke like a metronome against chaos. Time stretched. Demands were shouted toward the jet bridge. A negotiator's voice crackled back from the terminal. The hijackers wanted the pilots back, a new destination, leverage. In row 51, a father squeezed his daughter's hand. In 2A, a woman prayed into a silk scarf. It wasn't yet a story of heroes and villains. It was a story of minutes and what a single person can do inside them. Then came a moment that reshaped the arc of the next 16 hours. One of the hijackers dragged a young American citizen to the front door, forced him to his knees, and when the crew did not return, executed him in front of the cabin and the cameras beyond the windows. The shock rippled down the aisles like a pressure wave, gasps, sobs, hands over mouths. The message was unmistakable. Americans would be targeted. That is when Neerja's eyes met those of 2 other attendants, and in that silent exchange, a plan became a decision. This story will be told as 10 chapters, because what happened on Flight 73 is not just a headline. It's a sequence of choices, split seconds, and one audacious act by a flight attendant that would spare hundreds. But in this first chapter, hold on to the image of a young purser, shoulders squared, heartbeat contained, noticing everything. The horror was real. So was her resolve. In the muddled light of a sealed 747 cabin, power is theater. The interphone, the exit-armed lights, the glint of gun barrels, the little red toggles that mean everything and nothing to those who've never trained on them. After the shooting at the forward door, the lead hijacker, sweat beading on his brow, ordered the cabin crew to collect passports. He wanted nationalities sorted, Americans isolated. He thrust a pistol toward the attendants and bellowed to move. Neerja moved. She took service carts and plastic tote bins and began the sweep row by row, instructing her team in a tone that sounded obedient enough to be plausible. People complied in that dazed way hostages comply. They handed over little booklets that 5 minutes earlier were simply travel documents and now felt like lit fuses. A middle-aged couple from Ohio placed 2 navy blue passports into a plastic bag. A graduate student from Boston hesitated for an instant and then let his go too. In economy, a soldier on leave, not in uniform, pressed his lips into a line as his passport slid into the stack. In training, compliance and initiative are complementary tools. Knowing which to reach for is the art. Halfway down the second aisle, Neerja bent to adjust a blanket and whispered to a colleague, "Lose the American passports." It would have been easy for fear to make the decision muddy. Instead, her directive was sharp. Under seats, into chutes, into the grey moor of the galley trash compactor if needed. The point was not to defy loudly, it was to erase quietly. If the men with guns could not distinguish Americans, the power of their threat would vanish into the crowd. That single decision, taken in the middle of a cabin under a rifle's shadow, would keep targets from being marked for the rest of the day. A flight attendant at 34L moved with astonishing grace, palming 2 passports beneath a seat cushion as she nudged a crying toddler's feet back onto the upholstery. Another slipped 4 passports down the waist chute, disguised by a bundle of soiled napkins. Where surrender had been demanded, camouflage replaced it. By the time the bins reached the forward galley, the count of American documents was strangely light. So light, in fact, that the hijackers' next attempts to pull out US citizens only would be thwarted. Contemporary accounts agree, efforts by the gunmen to single out Americans were frustrated because the cabin crew hid US passports. People who have never been in a cabin crisis often imagine courage as a shout. Often, it is a choreography of whispers. Neerja didn't announce what she was doing to the passengers. She didn't need to. She needed just enough awareness among her team to act in concert. And so the cart kept moving, row after row, collecting documents that represented almost every continent. Italian maroon, German burgundy, British maroon, Indian navy, but conspicuously fewer of one kind. When the bin reached first class, Neerja set it down for inspection. One of the hijackers rifled through, cursed under his breath, and demanded they keep looking. He didn't know they already had. Minutes later, Neerja reached for the interphone again. In the gentlest, most neutral voice she could manage, she called for a British passenger by name to come forward. Michael Thexton. She used him in part as a way to slow the pace of violence, to get the lead hijacker talking, to buy the cabin time. Little tactics nest within big ones. The passport plan needed minutes to work. She found them where she could. Inside the plane, Americans felt something they could not name, the removal of a target from their backs. Outside, negotiators were being told that unless pilots returned, more would die. For the next long stretch of the day, they didn't. And inside, when the gunmen prowled the aisles, glaring at faces, holding up documents as if the paper alone could reveal allegiance, the pattern didn't cooperate. "Where are the Americans?" one snapped. The answer was everywhere and nowhere. Even heroes get scared. The point is that they act anyway. On that cabin floor, hem of her uniform brushing the carpet, Neerja enacted a quiet, technical miracle. She made a category vanish. Years later, summaries and tributes would compress the act into a single line. She hid the passports of the remaining American passengers. But inside the fuselage, it was more complex. A crew, spread across a 231-foot aircraft, executing a distributed deception under command. That decision doesn't sound cinematic when you say it fast. Say it slowly, and you hear what was at stake. Hundreds of people, men, women, and children with American passports, stopped being easy to find. The hijackers fumed, but the hostage calculus had shifted. Without identifiable Americans to parade or execute on camera, their leverage sagged. The standoff stretched into the afternoon heat. Hostages whispered to each other in many languages. Neerja moved among them, hands steady, voice soft, portfolios of fear and hope flickering in her eyes. She had made one decision, now she had to live with it for hours. By late morning, the 747 felt like a greenhouse. Auxiliary power kept the lights and ventilation on, but Karachi's heat pressed in through the skin of the aircraft. Children dozed, jerked awake, cried, dozed again. A woman near R4 fanned an elderly passenger with a folded safety card. A ground technician trapped on board whispered updates to a colleague across the aisle, trying not to attract attention. Every time a gunman strode past, the cabin stiffened, breaths held. When he disappeared behind a curtain, shoulders dropped a fraction. As the hours unfolded, Neerja's leadership moved through a simple cycle. Stabilize, humanize, prepare. Stabilize meant eye contact that said, "I see you." Water sips distributed fairly. The careful management of rumor. Humanize meant remembering names, crouching to talk to kids about pets or comics, checking on diabetics and the elderly to avoid a cascading medical emergency. Prepare meant quiet reminders to the crew about doors, slides and commands that might have to be shouted if the world suddenly went loud. She reviewed brace positions with a few rows as stretching exercises. She identified able-bodied volunteers near doors without making them obvious. If an opportunity came to evacuate, she didn't want to lose it to confusion. The crew's posture was deferential when watched, purposeful when not. When hijackers ordered first and business class toward the rear and the rear toward the front, the aisles clogged and the order largely dissolved into a nervous stalemate, a small blessing. Every rearrangement was a chance for a beating or a shooting. The less movement, the better. A few times, a hijacker would shout a prayer, adjust a weapon, and glare at the ceiling as if daring the plane itself to defy him. People averted their eyes and swallowed dry. Outside, negotiators pressed. Inside, the hijackers tried other tactics, tensely querying nationality row by row, barking for Yankees, failing to find a clean cluster because passports had been lost. In later summaries, officials would note the cabin crew frustrated identification of Americans by hiding their documents. In the immediate moment, it meant that a father from Detroit, who had planned a vacation in Germany, now looked like any other tourist. A woman from New Jersey on her way to a work conference in New York became, administratively, invisible. This was the payoff of that one decision. It diffused risk across the crowd, depriving the gunman of a simple binary, American or not. The clock felt viscous. 6 hours, 9, 12. Neerja kept time not by minutes, but by tasks completed. Infants fed from spare bottles, a diabetic stabilized with a shared snack, a terrified teenager coached through a breathing exercise. She also watched the airplane. A jumbo jet at rest is a living thing. Power units hum, fans sing, air is pushed and pulled. She knew that if the auxiliary power failed, darkness would slam down, the air would warm, and panic would spike. So she rehearsed the thought silently. If the lights die, move. If gunfire starts, open. She traced the path to the L3 door with her eyes, the handle's weight, the direction of the rotation, the imperative to assess slide deployment in a heartbeat. Those are the little calculations we never see in the headlines, and that save lives in the margins. Even in a siege, there are pockets of almost normal. A boy asked if the flight would still go to New York. A grandmother asked for tea because habit doesn't recognize hijackings. Crew brewed what they could without spilling or scolding. Someone told a joke in French and drew a ripple of laughter that felt illicit and medicinal. Neerja anchored these moments without letting them drift into denial. "We'll get you home," she murmured, meaning, "We will get you off this airplane." At roughly the 16-hour mark, as dusk slipped toward night, the cabin changed in a single exhale. The auxiliary power unit quit. Lights blinked and died. Emergency beacons glowed. The air shifted from conditioned to heavy. Adrenaline rose like a tide. In the near dark, a hijacker at the L1 door bowed his head in prayer and then aimed his weapon toward the explosive belt worn by another. The plan, pieced together later, was to detonate and kill everyone aboard, including themselves, rather than surrender. The shot didn't trigger the explosion they wanted. It triggered chaos instead. Automatic weapons barked. Bullets ricocheted off aluminum and plastic, turned by the cabin into shrapnel slicing through seatbacks and flesh. Grenades thumped and flashed. The aisle became a channel of screaming and motion. This is where training either owns you or you own it. Neerja lunged for the L3 exit. One of her colleagues moved toward R3. A ground staffer reached R4. The calculus was different at each door. Is the slide armed? Deployed, blocked by vehicles? In the storm of noise, Neerja wrenched the handle. The door cracked. The slide didn't fully bloom. She had seconds to decide whether to funnel people down anyway, jump them to the ramp, or hold. She moved bodies, children first, then anyone who could move under their own power. Across the cabin, other exits unlocked, and passengers pitched themselves into the dark, a ragged river of survival. In later reconstructions, investigators would say that the bullets caused most injuries. The slides that worked saved countless others. The crew bravely escorted as many passengers as they could first. That's bureaucratic language to describe something raw and human. People pulling strangers through a hole into night. And the numbers? History records them plainly. 379 aboard. 21 killed, about 120 injured, 358 survived. Statistics are cold. Inside the aircraft, they were names, faces, birthdays, future graduations, preserved because of lots of good work and one decisive act earlier in the day that kept Americans from being chosen and executed systematically. The passport decision didn't end the violence. Nothing could. But it stripped the gunmen of the clean political theater they craved and bought time that, when the cabin exploded into motion, translated into lives. He had packed for a 2-week swing through Europe. One carry-on, one checked bag, a paperback with a creased spine, and a navy blue US passport that, in every other context, made borders easier. In the dim light of row 43, that same booklet felt like a bullseye. He'd slid it into the seat-back pocket before the first shouts. When the cart came for documents, he hesitated, then handed it over with trembling fingers, and watched the purser's eyes meet his for a single second that said, "Trust me." Minutes later, he realized the bin had moved on, and his passport was gone. He searched the floor with his shoes, half panicked, half relieved. The absurdity landed in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wanted to be no one in particular. Around him, the cabin was a collage of small kindnesses under a ceiling of threat. A woman from Texas passed a bottle to a Pakistani grandmother. A teenager from Mumbai translated a frightened Italian's question into workable English. The crew, united by training but scattered by circumstance, glided between aisles, their smiles controlled so as not to appear defiant. Neerja's leadership showed up in the details. A whispered, "Breathe in for 4, out for 6, to a man on the edge of hyperventilating. A crouched conversation with 2 brothers about their dog back home. A careful reminder to a young mother to tuck her hair into her scarf because anything snagging during an evacuation could cost a second. The American in 43C watched the hijackers stalking for Yankees. Each time a gunman demanded to see papers, the pattern jammed. Burgundy, maroon, navy. But not that navy. The questions came faster, meaner. The answers kept dissolving. It was a strange way to be saved, not by being singled out, but by being made indistinguishable. He felt guilty and grateful in the same breath. He thought of his wife, who would be at her desk in New York, a coffee cooling beside the phone. He imagined what she'd say if he made it home. Who was she? And he knew the answer would be as simple as it was impossible. A flight attendant who decided my passport didn't matter. In the forward economy galley, Neerja reorganized the mental map of the cabin every few minutes. Who needed medical attention? Who would freeze at a command to run? Who could help at a door, quietly, immediately, if she pointed and said, "You here now"? She had marked in her mind 3 children traveling unaccompanied. She had marked the path between L3 and L4 as a potential corridor if the plane's nose became a killing ground, and she had stitched the crew into a threadbare but working net. A nod to the attendant near R2, a squeeze of the hand to the one at L4, a micro-brief. "If we go, I'll call children first." Hours stretch differently when you measure them in heartbeats. The American in 43C found a little ritual. Thumb the paperback, fold it open, stare at a paragraph without reading, close it. Each cycle took exactly a minute. He counted 90 of them. During one of those minutes, a hijacker spotted his anxious hands and snapped, "What are you hiding?" The man lifted the book like a shield and said truthfully, "Nothing." The gunman glared, then moved on. Something else, something structural, was denying him the satisfaction of control, and the rage curdled. The cabin's oxygen felt thin, even with the vents humming. Babies whimpered. A boy with a Yankees cap, the irony lost on no one, kept asking when he'd see the Statue of Liberty. "Soon," the American lied, "because hope is a form of oxygen too." He didn't know that hope had already been manufactured for him by a decision he hadn't seen. A passport dropping into a trash chute, another pushed beneath a cushion, a third tucked into a magazine, a fourth palmed into a galley bin and whisked away. All he knew was that the threat seemed blunter than the men had promised, and that the purser moved like a clock set to survival. When the lights finally died that night, and the first staccato of gunfire tore the dark, the American did what he had rehearsed in his head: unbuckle, crouch low, move when a hand motioned, follow a voice that said, "Go, go, go." He didn't even register the accent. He registered only the authority. Bodies surged, a slide hissed, the night air hit him like a wet towel, and his bare feet smacked rubber that felt like salvation. He tumbled, rolled, and lay panting on tarmac, blinking at a sky that had no walls. He would live. He would fly home. He would never again think of a passport as paper alone. By afternoon, a paradox governed the plane. Nothing was happening, and everything was happening. Negotiations outside looped and stalled. Inside, tensions coiled tighter, with each trip a gunman made up and down the aisle. For Neerja, leadership became the art of slowing a clock she couldn't see. Pace is power in a crisis. Move too fast and you spark violence. Move too slow and you bleed hope. She needed minutes, and when possible, hours. So she engineered conversations, not the grand speeches that make movie trailers, but small, sticky exchanges that buy time. She called a passenger forward by name to clarify a dietary need, then realized the person was seated in the wrong row and had to be walked back. She asked for permission to distribute water to avoid a medical incident, a request any captor understands carries liability. She negotiated for the release of an elderly woman who had begun to fade, framing it as a goodwill gesture that would make the outside world listen. Each successful ask nudged the timeline outward. At one point, a hijacker demanded names of Americans only, weaponizing language itself. Neerja met his stare, and in a voice that blended deference and professionalism, explained that passports had been collected and were being sorted, that the crew was still counting, that the cabin was a mosaic of nationalities. She gestured toward a French family, a German couple, 2 Indian businessmen, the Pakistani grandmother, and, crucially, not toward anyone who risked being dragged to the front. When he barked again, she repeated a version of the same answer with different words. Every repetition was a tiny speed bump. Every speed bump was a life. There is a method to this kind of soft obstruction. It asks you to look harmless and be anything but, to let your hands tremble from thirst so your voice can stay steady, to be willing to be yelled at if it means the barrel points at you and not at someone else. The crew mirrored her posture. One attendant offered to translate a demand that didn't need translation, then took a very long time to get it exactly right. Another fussed with a galley latch that wasn't stuck at all. They were artists of friction. Meanwhile, the passengers followed the crew's cues, consciously or not. Whispered games of I Spy occupied children. Strangers merged families for the afternoon. I'll hold your baby while you try to sleep, so that if the moment came to run, hands could be free. A diabetic found a seatmate who understood the signs and kept gentle watch. The cabin became a fragile neighborhood, policed by kindness. The lead hijacker, deprived of a clear target and a quick victory, grew erratic. He paced, he lectured, he jutted his chin toward the cockpit door, as if glaring could conjure pilots out of air. That cockpit, empty because 3 men had bailed out a hatch in the first minutes, remained the single most consequential absence in the aircraft. Without flight crew, the 747 was a building with wings. Without Americans neatly separated, the hijackers' political theater had a broken spotlight. Through all of it, Neerja kept one eye on the doors. Training makes teachers of checklists. She traced the motions again and again in her mind. Lift the cover, rotate the handle in a continuous motion, push the door out, assess the slide, command the evacuation. The words are blunt and practical. Jump, slide, run. But she also prepared the next layer. If the slide failed, there were backup verbs. Sit and go, to turn a faulty exit into a survivable jump. When the sun began to lean toward evening, she permitted herself exactly one private thought. If I can get these children out first, I can live with anything else. You could argue that this was a superstition or a prayer or simply a professional mantra from someone who understood triage. Maybe it was all three. Darkness came like a thrown switch. The auxiliary power died, the hum ceased, the ceiling lights went to black, and the aisle lights winked on with their eerie submarine glow. The first shot cracked the air a half-breath later, then another, then a stuttering barrage. No one had to be told. This was the moment the day had been circling. In the blooming chaos, training stood up and took the wheel. Gunfire in a cabin is a physics problem as much as it is a horror. Metal meets metal, trajectories glance, fragments shred plastic and cloth. People screamed and flattened. The smell, cordite and hot metal, poured into a space already freighted with sweat and fear. Over it all came a voice strong and steady, rising above the noise because it had been rehearsed in quiet. "Open your seatbelts! Leave everything! Come this way!" Neerja sprinted for L3. Every door on a 747 is its own little universe of levers, seals, and mechanical logic. Hands that know the choreography make it look easy. Her hand lifted the cover, gripped the handle, and rotated. The door cracked against the sudden pressure differential. The slide shouldered into the night air. She swept a glance down and saw it blooming. Not perfect, not textbook, but enough. And she turned to the mass of bodies and did what leaders do at the edge of panic. She made chaos obey. "Children first," she commanded, voice pitched to carry, words that arrange people into choices. Across the cabin, other doors began to work. R3 fought open and its slide deployed. R4 and L4, closer to the tail, less in the angles of fire, promised better shelter once you were outside. Passengers became runners, crawlers, jumpers. The choreography was brutal and simple. Go forward to go out, then away from the fuselage, then down onto tarmac and keep moving. Someone fell and someone else picked him up. Someone lost a shoe and didn't go back. A grandmother hesitated, and a stranger, half her age, put an arm under hers and launched them both into the dark. Neerja moved like a metronome set to urgency. A child at her hip, a hand at a shoulder blade, a gesture that said now. When a passenger balked at the edge, she demonstrated quick drop, feet and hips, glide, and the person followed. The most remarkable thing about courage in a stampede is its clarity. Her commands didn't dress themselves in heroics. They were crisp, functional and repeatable. Jump and slide. Run that way. Keep low. In the worst minute of many lives, instruction became mercy. Bullets scythed through seats. A burst ripped into the overhead, showering plastic. A grenade thumped and popped. The aircraft shuddered like a living thing. And still, the doors worked. A stuck slide at one exit became a sit-drop. Crews and passengers perched on the sill and scooted, 2 feet and a hop into gravity. Pain was postponed by adrenaline. A man with a gash on his calf ran as if nothing had happened. A woman with a torn blouse shoved her friend ahead of her and said, "Go!" Behind Neerja, a cluster of children gathered like ducklings, drawn to her voice in the dark. She steered them toward L3, counting as they went, one hand touching shoulder after tiny shoulder, creating a human rosary she would not let slip. A boy looked up, eyes saucer-wide, and she said, "You're going to slide, and then you're going to run to the lights. Ready?" He nodded because her certainty filled the space where his would have been. It took minutes, maybe 5, maybe 8. Time is shredded at those speeds, for the aisles to thin, for the press to ease, for the soundscape to tilt from raw to ragged. In that seam, she did what she had promised herself hours earlier. She made sure the littlest ones were in the wind before she turned back into the cabin that was still spitting sparks and noise. The math was cruel. Every second she stayed was risk moved from a passenger's body to hers. She stayed anyway. On the tarmac, responders began to swarm, faces lit by the pulsing blue of emergency lights. Some passengers lay flat, as trained hands over heads. Others crawled, others ran in zigzags, as if the bullets could be outwitted by geometry. The night devoured them, which in this case was grace. The darkness hid them as effectively as any wall. Back at L3, the purser took a breath you could sculpt out of the air, squared her shoulders, and turned to find 3 children tangled by fear and seatbelts. The next chapter of this story lives there, at the edge of a doorway, in a choice that parents and strangers will remember for the rest of their days. The blast of air past the open door tugged at hair and hems, a reminder that beyond the plane there was a world that didn't include men with guns. The 3 children were stuck in that sliver, the inside that must be escaped and the outside that must be reached. 2 were siblings, a pair of small hands welded together by instinct. The third was younger, alone, eyes glassy with shock. The belt had cinched in a twist that refused to yield to tiny fingers. Neerja dropped to a knee. The skin on the metal floor burned through her pantyhose. She slid her hands under the belt's tongue, pressed, lifted, and felt it give. "You're okay. Eyes on me," she told them, a teacher in the furnace of war. She pulled the slack free, nudged one child forward. "Sit on the edge, hands on your knees, now slide," and turned to the second. Behind her, the cabin howled. Another burst, another scream, the sound of a galley cart tipping and skittering. Still, she worked the belt like a seamstress with a stubborn stitch. It popped. She swiveled, placed the child at the threshold, and pointed into the night. "Run to the flashing lights." The third child hesitated. That's the moment fear chooses to claim or release you. Neerja did the one thing that gets people moving when legs won't listen. She made the decision smaller. "We're going to count to 3, she said, voice steady as granite. 1, 2, the child leaned. She guided the body to the sill. 3. A tiny shape slid into the dark and thumped onto the slide. 2 steps, 3, 4, gone towards safety. She turned to scan for more. A passenger stumbled toward the door, eyes wild, and yanked at her sleeve. "Come with us," he pleaded, a reflex born of gratitude and terror. She shook her head in the way professionals do, a refusal wrapped in gentleness. "Go." That single syllable contained a lifetime of purpose. She pivoted for one more check of the aisle. Anyone pinned, anyone frozen, anyone small, and that's when the bullets reached for her. The accounts that live in survivors' mouths are consistent about what mattered. She was still there when they needed her most. She was pushing people out when staying meant dying. She was a wall where none existed. The physics of heroism are simple and terrible. A body placed between danger and a child becomes a shield. She didn't announce it. She became it. People poured past in the seconds that followed, pulled by the current she had created. Some of them would only later understand the price of that current. On the tarmac, they would ask each other, "Where is she?" They would turn and look at the torn rectangle of the door and imagine a silhouette still framed there. They would carry her forward in the only currency survivors have to pay with, remembrance and the way they tell the story. In every airline's training manual, there's a line about self-preservation balanced with duty of care. In every great crew member's heart, there's a line that overwrites it when needed. The balance tilts toward duty and keeps tilting until the scale breaks. In those last seconds, Neerja wasn't choosing between living and dying. She was choosing who got the seconds she had left. She spent them on children. That's not a legend. It's a ledger. And yet, despite the tragedy at the doorway, the measure of her decision echoed beyond that moment. Because hours earlier she had erased a target category from the cabin, the hijackers had been denied the neat sequence of executions they sought. Because the cockpit had been emptied in the first minute, they had been denied the terrible option of flight. Because the exits bloomed, the crowd had pathways. Every earlier choice compounded into this minute, tilting hundreds of lives toward the night. On the ramp, a firefighter scooped up a child who had reached the bottom of the slide and simply sat, stunned. He wrapped the kid in his jacket and looked back at the airplane, a cathedral of light and dark. He'd fought building fires where walls groaned like animals, but he had never seen a building that ran, that breathed, that bled light the way this one did. And he wondered, not for the first time that night, how it is that a single person's voice can herd 1,000 panicked choices into a path that looks like deliverance. The first sensation outside was sound. Sirens mixing with shouted commands. The slap of feet on baked concrete, the shuddering cough of emergency vehicles. Then came the lights, blue and red and white, strobing across faces that didn't yet know if they were safe. Passengers clustered into ad hoc groups, each circle its own bilingual babble of shock. Some hugged with a ferocity only strangers can summon after sharing a tunnel. Some were terribly quiet, gazes free-falling into middle distance. Responders worked a triage pattern learned over years and sharpened in seconds. Ambulatory first, then assess the fallen, then sweep again for the lost. A woman in a peach blouse wouldn't stop apologizing for tearing a sleeve on the slide. A man in a business suit vomited neatly onto his tie and said, "Excuse me," to no one in particular. Children keened and then stopped, looking around for the voice that had told them what to do. When they didn't find it, some borrowed courage from each other, audiences to their own survival. From the open doors of the 747, people still reigned. A line of airport workers formed a human vector, waving survivors toward a safe zone behind vehicles. The night carried heat even then, rising off the tarmac in waves. The smell of aviation fuel is always there at an airport. That night, it braided with cordite and panic and sweat into a scent survivors would smell for years in their sleep. Security forces moved on the aircraft with a predator's caution, pausing, proceeding, gesturing silently. The calculus had shifted. With the cabin evacuating, the hijackers lost leverage quickly. Shouts rose from the fuselage and fell again. A cluster of men were dragged across the tarmac in the same cuffs they had hoped to be the ones issuing. Faces turned to watch, to memorize, to promise themselves that the horror had a boundary. An ambulance door slammed, another. The choreography of emergency medicine is its own kind of grace. Questions fired in a crisp cadence. Name, allergies, pain here, here. And hands doing what hands must do. IV lines bloomed like vines. Pressure dressings held. Someone prayed over a stranger because prayer is what she had to give. Someone looked for their passport because habit resurfaces in the oddest, most human ways. It's gone, The American in 43C told a responder, half laughing, "And that's how I'm alive." As the hour bent past midnight, a roll call of the living began under floodlights. Names were shouted into the dark and answered by hoarse voices. "Here. Yes, I'm here." The word "here" did more than locate a body. It declared a future. In the chaos, a young woman counted children with a ferocity that scared even her. 1, 2, 3. Where was the fourth? He reappeared hand in hand with a firefighter, clutching a foil blanket like a cape. "I flew," he announced, and the firefighter said, "Yeah, kid, you did." A line of buses idled, their diesel rattle a baseline under the scene. Survivors climbed aboard, entered the rectangular quiet, and stared into smudged windows. The city beyond the airport slept, not knowing that its name would be braided forever with their worst day. Some closed their eyes and saw the aisle again, repeating like a loop. Some said nothing. Some texted on early model phones, words hitching across networks. "I'm alive," messages that would be read and reread until the pixels wore thin. On the periphery, a circle of crew members stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes red, bodies vibrating with the aftershocks. Professionals always have to do two things at once in the aftermath: allow themselves to be human and remain the instrument the situation still needs. One attendant remembered a line from training, "Debrief will come later," and felt a ridiculous urge to laugh. Later felt like a country you needed a passport to reach, and passports, as the day had taught them, could vanish. In the weeks and months after, investigators would frame findings in careful language, and airlines would issue memos that read like bolts and brackets: tight, precise, impersonal. But beneath those pages moved a more human current, the understanding that a decision made in the first hours had changed the math of survival for everyone on board. The instruction to lose the American passports sounds small when you put it on paper. In the compressed atmosphere of that cabin, it was tectonic. Here's the uncomfortable simplicity. Hostages are power when they are categories. Americans only, men only, crew only. Strip away the category, and a gunman stands in front of a crowd he doesn't understand and can't easily exploit. It isn't that he cannot kill, it's that he cannot narrate the killing in the way he intends. He is robbed of symbolism. When Neerja set that plan in motion, she didn't just hide documents, she hid a narrative. In doing so, she multiplied chances. Chances that negotiations would drag, that rage would misfire, that the final act, when it came, would be a messy, panicked unraveling, and messy unwinding gives normal people more pockets to escape through than tidy evil does. Training programs changed in quiet ways because of that day. Scripts for crew now explicitly include strategies to frustrate targeting. Drills take more seriously the need to pre-identify vulnerable passengers and move them early, given any sliver of a chance. The phrasing of evacuation commands is more disciplined, short, rhythmic, cut to fit through adrenaline's narrow doorway. And interphone codes, door-arming rituals and cross-checks took on a new ferocity in execution. A single lapse can steal a second. A stolen second can distort an outcome. Families in the United States stitched their lives back together on a timeline all their own. Some did it by talking, endlessly, looping the story until it lost a little of its barbed edge. Some did it by not talking at all, letting the day become a scar under clothing. Children who came down those slides grew up into adults who fold seatbelt ends into a loop before takeoff without realizing they're doing it. A man who once cared about loyalty points and aisle seats learned to count exits by rows and to make contact with a flight attendant on every trip. "You're the reason this works," he says, and he means the profession, and he means her. In the broader culture, we reach for the word hero because it's short and it makes emotional sense, but hero can blur the craft inside the courage. What happened on that airplane was not only a willingness to risk, it was competence under fire, the patient harvesting of minutes, the manipulation of optics, the shepherding of bodies with simple words toward rectangles in metal. The passport decision was clever because it was practical. It worked because it was executed collectively. It mattered because it changed what the men with guns could know. There is something almost democratic about the way survival was distributed that night. The crew's plan didn't pick winners. It erased a category so that the deck could be reshuffled by chance and choice, by who was near which door at which second, by whose hand grabbed whose wrist. It replaced a script written by terrorists with one written by physics and human decency. And in that rewrite lives the legacy, not the denial of horror, but the proof that within horror live tools we can learn to use. If you build the film of that day in your head, the ending is not the sirens or the floodlights or even the arrests. It is quieter. It is the way a child later tells his own child that an airplane once became a school where adults taught with their bodies. It is the way a man from 43C buys coffee for every flight attendant he meets for a year and then eventually starts doing it without announcement or ceremony for the rest of his life. It is the way a grandmother touches the wall by the door as she boards and whispers, "Thank you," meaning the person and the idea. We want clean morals from dirty days. Here is one that fits without sanding the edges. The most technical parts of courage are made of attention. Attention to doors and belts and crowd flow. Attention to how fear moves through groups. Attention to when a voice should be a whisper and when it should be a command. Neerja's single decision was not isolated from the rest of her attention. It was a beam in a structure she built minute by minute. She removed a category to save people whose names she didn't know. She opened a door for children who may not remember her face. She chose to be an instrument that day, and instruments play on after the player is gone. For an American audience, this is a story about being seen and being unseen at the same time. Those blue passports, so potent in most contexts, became a liability inside a metal tube guarded by rage. The paradox is that protection came not from declaring identity, but from dissolving it. That's not a way any of us want to live. It is, however, a tactic worth remembering. Sometimes to deny violence its aim, you blur the target until it can't find you. When the survivors gather, online, in occasional rooms, in the geography of memory, they speak a common tongue, gratitude flavored with disbelief. They say, "It could have been all of us," and the grammar there matters. Not "it could have been me," but us. The logic of mass casualty works both ways. Loss spreads outward, so does salvation. A command yelled the right way ripples. A hand pushing at the right second ripples. A passport quietly vanished ripples. Hundreds of circles out from the aircraft, those ripples keep moving. Into training rooms, into families, into the way we tell our children to look for the exit row before they look for the window view. Some stories end at monuments and medals. Those matter. But the measure that endures longest is more domestic. It's in the way a former passenger packs snacks for flights now to hand to a parent traveling alone. It's in the way a business traveler offers to swap seats so a nervous flyer can have the aisle near the door. It's in the thank yous whispered to crews who pre-board and cross-check and memorize names they'll only hold for 6 hours. It's in the decision you might make someday, in some small crisis, to erase a category that would otherwise hurt someone. Airplanes teach us more than how to leave the ground. They teach us how to be responsible for each other in compressed spaces. On that September day, a young purser taught with extraordinary clarity. If you listen closely at the threshold of any jet bridge, you can still hear the echo. Children first. Jump and slide. Run to the lights. And beneath it, a quieter instruction for all of us. Use your attention like a tool. That's how 200 lives and more were held above the worst outcome by a single lucid choice.